Good evening. Good evening, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening. My name is Kenda Crozier, and I'm the head of the School of Nursing and Midwifery here at Queen's. And welcome to this evening's guest lecture by one of our honorary professors of practice. Pat Cullen was appointed as honorary professor of practice in the 2023-24 academic year. And she's a nurse who has a strong background, first in patient advocacy and as a powerful advocate for nurses and nursing as a profession. Pat grew up in rural Tyrone, which, as some of you know, is a place that's very close to my heart. She trained in Antrim, worked in mental health nursing and community. She's going to tell you all about her journey, so I'm not going to give too much away. Her journey, as you all know, has taken her from nursing in the community to leadership as part of the Department of Health, a nursing officer in the Department of Health at Stormont, and then on to the Royal College of Nursing, regionally here in Belfast, and then as the National Leader, General Secretary and Chief Executive. As the voice of over 465,000 nurses, she spoke very powerfully and compassionately about the challenges facing the profession post-pandemic. And that approach to understanding patients' and nurses' viewpoints created public support for the first national nurses' strike in the UK. And that's quite something to bring the public along with you on something like that. Her decision to move into politics was met with surprise by some, but was probably an inevitable trajectory. And we look forward to hearing your story, Pat, and to hearing your hopes for the future in tonight's lecture. Please join me in welcoming Professor Pat Cullen.
Good evening, everyone. And just before you sit down, Ken, that probably was just as big a surprise to me, the move. But there you are. I'll tell you a wee bit about that as I move forward this. Good evening, everyone, and thanks very much for being here. I have got a little talk that I want to work through, and the first thing that I tried to do after my 50th attempt to write this was come up with a title. So I've titled my presentation From Ward to Westminster. And I believe it is a journey of care, courage, and change. So invited guests and colleagues, and indeed friends, and of course my lovely family. It is a real pleasure and an honour to be here this evening to deliver this inaugural lecture. As I said, it was about 50 times. I'll tell you a secret. I said to my daughter earlier on this morning after I got my 50th presentation done, I said, now, Teresa, sit down and listen to your mummy to see if all this makes sense. And she says, of course I will. And next thing I looked over, she was sitting on the bed. Next thing she was fast asleep. So I thought to myself, now, if that's the impact I make this afternoon, I'll be doing very, very poorly at this lot. So I've done a whole lot of things in my life, as any good nurse does. But I have to say this is a first for me. I never actually went through nurse academia, except personally myself, but I did toil with the idea of becoming a lecturer at one stage, and I was never accepted in. So there you are. That's why I never got a job in academia. So to be invited to reflect on a journey that has taken me from the wards and homes of mighty Belfast to the corridors of Westminster, for me, colleagues, is both humbling and pretty surreal. So the title of my lecture is From Ward to Westminster, a journey of care, courage, and indeed of change. And what I'm trying to do over the next 40 minutes or so is to set out how my journey through nursing has shaped me as a politician, and how both these journeys are absolutely entwined and interlinked. I hope to show that there are connections between nursing and politics. And I truly believe that politics would be all the richer if we had more nurses at the centre of policy decision making. So, if anyone had told me as a young nurse when I started out in 1982, and now stop guessing my age because you'll be working that one out, that one day I'd be standing here in Queen's University speaking not as a practitioner, but as a member of Parliament, I would have smiled very politely and shaken my head. And I might have said a few choice words because I was a wee bit of a renegade. I see Rita Devlin laughing at that one. She knows me only too well. My world then was defined by wards, by patients, and by the rhythms of care, not the rhythms of debate and policy. And yet, when I look back, every step along that road has been connected by a single thread, the belief that leadership begins with care. So I began my nurse training in 1982, at a time when mental health care was only beginning to emerge from behind the large walls of institutions. I chose mental health nursing not because it was in any way glamorous, it most certainly was not, but because it spoke to something very, very deep within me. The conviction that every person deserves to be heard, to be seen, and to be valued. It was for me a profession rooted in humanity. When I qualified, I worked in a range of clinical areas, mostly within acute mental health units, and then for quite a while within psychiatric intensive care. And it was during these early years that I developed my activist skills, particularly in the area of advocacy. For anyone that's as old as me, that worked within mental health at this time, you will remember that therapeutic interventions were minimal. And other than pharmacological interventions, one method applied to control patients who displayed less than compliant behaviour was an intervention known as token economy. The token economy was a form of behaviour modification therapy rooted in Skinner's behaviourist principles. Patients earned tokens for displaying desired behaviours. For example, at that time, getting out of bed, dressing themselves, attending therapy sessions, helping with ward chores, all of those sorts of things. These tokens then would have been exchanged for rewards, such as, at that time, cigarettes, extra visiting time, snacks, access to TV, or indeed time off ward, those sorts of things. The idea was to positively reinforce appropriate behaviours and to reduce dependency. And us as nursing staff, and when I thought about this today, I was 21 at this stage with absolutely no world experience. Nursing staff were central to running those schemes. However, it was the consultant medical staff who decided the tokens for individuals. They wouldn't do it now, but anyway, they did then. However, in the late 1980s, the approach was considered to be increasingly controversial. And most hospitals had stopped using the approach, but the hospital that I was in at that point in time was playing a little bit of catch up, and it was still widely used. So when I took up my first staff nurse post in the psychiatric intensive care unit, I personally, even at that age, was deeply uncomfortable with that application. I was acutely aware of the power imbalance between staff and patients in institutional care. I knew the approach was dehumanising and encouraged coercive behaviour. So I decided to approach this formidable consultant and request that the practice would cease. And I'm sure colleagues, as you'd expect, it went down like an absolute lead balloon. And of course, I ended up then in the senior nursing officer's office and reprimanded. And actually, when I was writing this, I found myself back in that office and could feel every single part of that reprimand. Even though I can forget a whole lot in life, I didn't forget that. And that made me even more determined to try another approach. So I got a letter drafted up. There were typewriters at that stage. That's how old I am. There was no computers. And I got that letter signed by all of our patients and a few staff who were willing, even at that stage, to put their head above the parapet. And I maybe cheekily presented that at the next full ward round when everybody else was present, because in my maybe naive way, I thought I would maybe embarrass this gentleman into doing the right thing for the people that we were there to serve. So I also let the sister know, and she was as equally formidable as the consultant was, that on my shifts, I would not engage in the scheme. And if forced, I told her that I would issue twice as many cigarettes. I would give the patients twice as much time off the wards, and I would empty her tuck shop. If you remember, there were tuck shops at that stage on the wards. And I said, I'll empty them of every sweet and bun you have. And she had a really sweet tooth, so she was really pissed off. So eventually the patients took their own power into each of their own hands. And each and every one of those people, simply because they felt they had an advocate, came before that consultant and said they were no longer willing to comply. And together, as a group, we got the change and the practice did cease. And for me, colleagues, this was just a very small example of standing firm on what is the right thing to do and speaking up for people who don't have an equal voice in society. Now, shortly after this, I was moved to work in the community. Now, I don't know if the two were linked, but I have a funny suspicion they might have been. But at that point, that was the start of a new point in my career. And in 1988-89, I began working as a community psychiatric nurse in North and West Belfast at the height of the conflict. The Belfast of the 1980s was a place where fear and mistrust often hung heavily in the air. Streets were divided by peace lines. Communities lived in parallel worlds, and every journey to a patient's home could carry risk. Yet, it was there amid all of that tension and the trauma that I learned the real meaning of mental health nursing, of service, and above all, courageous leadership. Mental health nursing in that context demanded more than clinical skill. It demanded courage, humility, and the capacity to listen without judgment. I remember walking up the streets where you could feel the tension long before you saw the face of anyone. There were times when, as a nurse, you were the only person welcomed into a home from the other side. People might not have trusted each other, but they trusted the nurse. That trust was sacred. Indeed, it is only when I look back at those years that I understand the people that I looked after us as young community nurses, particularly the women in these communities. They were the stalwarts. They were full of care. They were full of compassion. They were incredibly strong, and the commitment to their families and their communities was palpable. And then to us. Now, because I was young, free and single, I underestimated how much these women shaped my entire life and taught me the importance of communities, the importance of having courage and always staying the pace. They never, ever give up. And whilst their health suffered, they continued to care for their families, their neighbours, their communities, and it was just really, really hard to get them to take 5 minutes out for themselves. Nursing in Belfast during those years, in its own way, was an act of peace building. Every time we crossed a boundary, every time we cared for someone without asking anything about their political views or opinions, we affirmed something profoundly human. We affirmed that compassion is stronger than conflict. And just for the record, they never asked anything about me. They never questioned my personal attributes, views, or political affiliations. And actually then I didn't have any. These were proper relationships built on trust, built on integrity and compassion. These were the happiest and most fulfilling days of my clinical career. Those experiences shaped my understanding of leadership long before I ever held a formal title. They taught me to see the person before the problem, to listen before speaking, and to recognize that authority means nothing without authenticity. When you're a nurse, you learn the essence of leadership: calm in crisis, clarity in communication, and compassion in absolutely every decision. You learn to act decisively even when the stakes are human lives. You learn leadership is about service and not about power. Those lessons shaped me personally very profoundly. They taught me that authority comes not from position, but from trust. And that trust is earned through authenticity, consistency, and above all, integrity. Even then, I began to see that the nurse's role extended beyond the bedside or the community facility. We were not only caring for individuals, we were navigating systems, policies, and structures that too often failed the very people that we ought to serve. The more I worked within those systems, the more I saw how decisions made far from the front line shaped the lives of those that we cared for. That realization planted a seed. The idea that to truly advocate for patients, we also needed to influence the structures that governed the care. Now, as I moved from frontline nursing into leadership roles, I carried those early lessons with me: the power of listening, the importance of trust, and the quiet conviction that change does begin with compassion. When I joined the Department of Health as a nurse advisor, I stepped into a world of policy papers, committees, and civil service language, far cry from the immediacy of the ward or the community visit. Yet what I quickly came to understand was that the same skills that mattered in practice, empathy, communication, and integrity, mattered just as much in leadership. In government, every decision touches real lives. The policies debated in meeting rooms ripple outward, shaping the realities of patients, families, and their staff. My role was to bring the voice of nursing, and more importantly, the voice of patients, into each of those conversations. And it wasn't always easy. There were moments when compassion had to fight for space amid competing priorities and political pressures. But I believed then, as I do now, that leadership is about persistence, about holding the line on what matters most, even when it is really uncomfortable. So when I became General Secretary and Chief Executive of the Royal College of Nursing in 2021, I felt the full weight of responsibility that came with representing 560,000 nurses, right across England, Scotland, Wales, and of course, here at home. I'd spent a lifetime in and around the profession, but nothing truly prepares you for the scale of that leadership. Suddenly, the concerns that used to arrive in the form of one patient, one team, or one ward were multiplied by hundreds of thousands. Every decision affected the lives of nurses in every corner of the country, and in turn, the safety of millions of patients. It was also a time of enormous strain. We were emerging from the worst of the pandemic, but the toll it had taken on nurses was immeasurable. They were physically exhausted, emotionally depleted, and morally injured. Many had seen things that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. They had held the hands of dying patients when families couldn't be there. They had worked through fear, uncertainty, and grief. And yet, despite that sacrifice, too many felt unseen and undervalued. And it was my role as their General Secretary to listen to every story, but more importantly, to act on it. In those first months, I travelled widely, visiting every single hospital across England and Wales, and indeed in Scotland. And I had Rita Devlin doing it at home with me. I visited clinics and community services right across the UK. I met nurses who had given everything and who still found the strength to turn up every single day. Their stories were humbling, but they were also haunting. I heard about unmanageable workloads, unsafe staffing levels, and pay that no longer covered the basics of living. I saw experienced nurses leaving the profession because they simply couldn't sustain it any longer. When you listen to enough stories, leadership becomes not a choice, but for me, an obligation. The RCN had never called strike action across the UK in its 106-year history. Nurses are caregivers. To take to the picket line for many was almost unthinkable. But there comes a point when silence becomes complicity. Throughout 2022, we sought dialogue, we presented evidence, we held meetings, we wrote letters, and we urged and begged for negotiation. But as the months went on, it became painfully clear that the government, a Conservative government at that time, was not willing to come to the table. The refusal to engage was not just frustrating for me and the team around me. It was demoralising. It felt as though the voices of nursing were being deliberately ignored, and of course they were. Leadership demanded balance, passion without rage, conviction without aggression. How we led this action would define how the public saw the profession for years and years to come. Media. The media became both a platform and a battleground. On one hand, we saw extraordinary public support. People stood beside our nurses on picket lines, offering coffee, hugs, and gratitude. But there was also criticism, headlines questioning whether nurses should strike at all, accusations of putting patients at risk. I knew that we had to hold the line, and my message and the team's message never changed. This was not a strike against patients. It was a strike for patients. Patients were not dying because nurses were striking. Nurses were striking because patients were dying. Safe staffing saves lives. Very simple. Fair pay keeps nurses in the profession. And without nurses, there is no National Health Service. Leading strike action was leadership grounded not in confrontation, but in total conviction. As General Secretary and Chief Executive, I drew on the skills I learned all those years ago in North and West Belfast. Courage, conviction, integrity, and commitment. However, I also discovered that leading at national level demanded another kind of courage, moral courage, the courage to speak truth to power, the courage to challenge entrenched systems, the courage to lead a profession through change, even when that change feels really, really uncomfortable. And leading through that time required courage, calm, and clarity. I faced criticism from those who thought we had gone too far, and disappointment from those who thought we hadn't gone far enough. But leadership often means standing in that uncomfortable middle ground, absorbing the frustration of both sides whilst refusing to waver on your principles. Eventually, the strike did not deliver everything we had hoped for, but it achieved something, personally, I feel, that was something much, much greater. It gave nurses a voice that could no longer be ignored. It showed that the most trusted profession in the country could also be one of the most powerful. It reminded the public, and perhaps the government too, that care is not infinite. It must be supported, it must be respected, and above all, it must be valued. Now, when that chapter closed, another began. I'd spent my life and my career advocating for nurses and patients, influencing from outside the political system, Increasingly, I felt drawn to step inside. I wanted to bring the values of nursing, compassion, honesty, and service into the heart of political decision making. And that conviction led me in 2024 to stand for election to Westminster. When I moved from professional and trade union leadership into political life, people often ask me why politics. And colleagues, I ask myself that most days when I get up in the morning. But my answer is simple, because influence does have its limits. You can advocate for change, you can argue for reform, but at some point you realize that to change or influence the system, you must be inside it. In politics, I discovered that the same qualities that make me an effective nurse leader also make me an effective politician. Empathy, courage, belief, resilience, and a deep, deep understanding of people. Politics at its best is simply advocating at scale. It is standing up for those that find it difficult to have a voice or those without a voice. It is in many ways an extension of nursing itself, only now the patient is the health system, and that system is genuinely in need of care. Across both my professional and political paths, several characteristics have proven essential. Integrity, doing what's right, even when it costs you personally. Authenticity, being grounded in who you are and where you've come from. Courage, not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite fear. Strategic vision, seeing beyond the crisis of the moment to the change that will endure. And finally, emotional intelligence, understanding that leadership is, above all, about relationships. So when I was elected the MP for Fermanagh and South Tyrone, I knew that this chapter of my life, like the previous ones, would carry both privilege and principle. I stood as a proud nurse and proud of my personal convictions, committed to a very particular form of representation, one that almost 25,000 people voted for. Representation is about voice, not visibility. It is about outcomes, not optics. Again, it is my profession that has taught me that leadership is rarely about being at the head of the table. It is about what you do for others when no one is watching. It is about influence, not authority. And again, it is about integrity, doing the right thing, even when others may not understand your choice. Leadership in nursing and in politics both demand the ability to balance compassion with conviction, to hold empathy in one hand and accountability in the other. Nurses are expert listeners. We listen not just to what is said, but we listen to the unsaid, to fear, to silence, and to hesitation. That skill has shaped how I work as a politician, listening first and speaking later. Political leadership offers something really, really powerful, the ability to turn advocacy into action. Through legislation, funding decisions, and scrutiny of government policy, political roles can change the conditions under which care is delivered. But the greatest contribution clinicians can make in politics is not technical expertise, it is credibility. The lived understanding of what works, what matters, and what must change. That's why we need more nurses, we need more clinicians, we need more voices from the front line of delivering health and care services at the policy making table. We need more nurses, doctors, allied health professions, and educators to step forward to shape political decisions on behalf of the people that we serve. Because we learn to speak for those who cannot always speak for themselves. That instinct to challenge injustice and protect the vulnerable has guided me in every decision I make as a Member of Parliament. Nurses know the importance of being calm under pressure, and particularly mental health nurses. The same is true in public life. Politics can be noisy, it can be reactive and polarized, but leadership requires the steadiness to hold a calm space, to seek solutions rather than headlines. Empathy, too, remains central. In nursing, empathy bridges difference. In politics, it allows understanding. It keeps us connected to the human impact behind every policy decision. Now, in politics, the pace can be relentless and the scrutiny can be unyielding. Every word, every vote, every decision is examined and debated. But even in that environment, there are extraordinary opportunities to make a difference, to bring compassion into policy, evidence into debate, and authenticity into leadership. In conclusion, leadership in politics requires the same resilience that leadership in nursing does. It is about capacity to stand firm on your values whilst navigating uncertainty. The opportunity lies in bringing humanity into a system that can so easily lose sight of it. And perhaps above all, hope. The quiet, steady hope that the work that we do, in whatever form it takes, can help to build a fairer and kinder world. So, what have I learned in my journey from ward to Westminster? I've learned that leadership is a continuum, from the quiet act of holding a patient's hand to the public act of holding a government to account. That credibility is built through consistency. That conviction must be balanced with compassion. And that integrity is the one value that must never, ever be negotiated. Now, a very wise manager, nurse manager, told me many, many years ago. She said, Pat, and I was in my first managerial post, she said, never prostitute your professional principles for anyone. And I've never forgotten that statement. Even at that time, it did make me blink a few times. Because ultimately, leadership is not about being in charge. It's about caring enough to make things happen. I often say that I didn't stop being a registered nurse when I entered politics. And of course, I remain a registered nurse. I simply changed wards. The patients are now the public. The care plan is the policy. The outcomes are measured not in vital signs, but in the health of our services and in the well-being of our people. And my purpose remains the same: to care, to advocate, and to lead with integrity. Now, before I finish, I want to turn to the health and care system that we find ourselves responsible for here. Our health and care system is facing a defining moment. For years, we've seen the convergence of multiple issues and challenges: a stretched workforce, record waiting lists, gaps in social care, and a political environment that too often left health policy in limbo. Reform and transformation has been promised many times, and yet delivery has faltered, not because of lack of will amongst staff or leaders, but because of structural fragility and inconsistent political direction. The opportunities, however, do remain immense. Our health and care system has a proud record of innovation, of community-based care initiatives, of integration between health and social care systems that many systems throughout the world envy. In addition, we have world-renowned universities providing world-leading education, as well as leading the way in research and development. But we must now invest in the workforce, rebuild public confidence, and deliver transformation that is both sustainable and person-centred. The task before us is to move from crisis management to strategic transformation, to shift from firefighting to a system of redesign. That will require political stability, it requires cross-party cooperation, and it requires courageous leadership at all levels. We need to reimagine what health and care can be. It needs to be delivered from a public health perspective. Prevention, detection, equitable, and focused on outcomes, clinically effective and clinically safe. And perhaps most importantly, we must restore hope for those who deliver care and for those who depend upon it. For me, working in a political environment brings both privilege and pressure. The privilege is the platform I now have, giving me the opportunity to shape and influence decisions that affect an entire population and to hold power to account. But the pressure comes from the constant balancing act between principle and pragmatism. Making a difference, to bring compassion into policy, evidence into debate, and authenticity into leadership. So colleagues, in conclusion, leadership in politics requires the same resilience that leadership in nursing does. It is about the capacity to stand firm on your values whilst navigating uncertainty. The opportunity lies in bringing humanity into a system that can so easily lose sight of it. So thank you very much.